Hi everyone. Thanks for coming. Hello. So I'm Samantha. I'm one of the co-founders of Tender Claws and the lead writer. This is Tanya.
Hi. I'm the producer for the studio.
So how many of you know any of our work? Cool. Awesome. All right. So we don't have to start from scratch, but we can fill in as well. So we're kind of known for creating story-driven experiences and games that push the boundaries of different forms of technology while walking this fun line between having a commercial following and the weird. So it's an interesting place to start. We started approximately 13 years ago. It was a collaboration between myself, my partner Danny Cannizzaro, and now we grew to 5, and now we're about 12. We're from everybody who works at Tender Claws. We all wear different hats, so we're all from very interdisciplinary backgrounds. My personal background is I started as a freshman doing creative writing in a program that was specifically focused on writing for digital media and nonlinear experiences. And then I got my MFA, and finally I'm finishing my PhD in digital media performance and creative writing and media studies. So this is, there's Tanya in the tub, if the source comes up.
I have background of my BA's on art theory and administration, then a master's in film. I'm also a puppeteer, did a lot of theater, and I'm also a filmmaker. So as Samantha was saying, we all do different things.
So this talk is actually going to be interesting because we're going to do something we've never done before, which is actually show some of the scripts that we write and take you behind the scenes in the writing process for some of our projects. Sorry. And director versus player agency is something that we're very interested in. And one of the main things is our approach to creating games and experiences that maintain a directorial structure and intention while leaving room for exploration and discovery and kind of layers of unfolding meta-narrative under that. To distill it down, it's very simple. 2 of the tenets of our design philosophy that kind of runs through all of our projects is this idea that how does the medium's affordances and constraints that you're working in make something that offers truly unique opportunities for directors and players, and how does that influence how far you can push the writing and how someone will encounter the writing and how it shapes the story. The other one is something that's more subtle. If you follow games, particularly Twine or some of the choose your own adventure games, we're very interested in creating narrative that is not just node based or point A or B, but that can feel responsive, that can feel that it's filling in and responding to the player's actions in very subtle ways. And we do that through some specific design decisions. However, we still want the player to know that they have a choice and they have a sort of ability to affect the outcome.
And then there's the whole area in production of getting all of these to play nice with each other. And in order to do that, we need to have clear communication, harnessing all the core ideas through different disciplines, again, from the writers to the programmers, the art department, sound. And we also work crowdsourcing and applying a lot of our collective knowledge, because we'll go on some of the case studies, but one of the departments will have a finding that then spearheads something in the interactions or even the story.
So one of the things that I want to show as soon as this comes back is the very first project we did as Tender Claws, which was called Pry. And Pry was originally curated by Yelena for Future of Storytelling in 2014, and was one of Apple's top apps of 2015. But it laid a lot of the groundwork for some of the projects we're going to show you, including the theater project that we're working on.
Right.
They never speak of her. I picture her between us, right before it hit. Sometimes she looks back at me. Then nothing. A wet red pain, a spade slicing like a knife, a hand reaching.
Okay, so this is behind the scenes, a diagram of a chapter of Pry. And in this particular chapter, and I know it's very small, but the idea is that a lot of the chapters of Pry, as you may have seen, have a kind of mechanic where we're thinking about basically the gesture of touch and what it means to actually use the gesture of touch and reading into our character's mind, especially an unreliable narrator, where there's an element of intimacy. And we responded basically to the hype around the ebook, where a lot of early ebooks were like on the road with like smooth jazz playing over it, or like, you know, a Winnie the Pooh story with a video like tied in between the text. And we wanted to do something that felt really integrated and really took advantages of the affordances of tablet reading. And in this particular map, we think of it as like the reader or the player or the user having control over the edit. But we as directors have a general control over the timeline and the beats we want to hit. But sometimes we can do it subtly so that the person who's intaking the media doesn't fully realize the way that they're being directed. So when you're prying open the eyes at any point, and it's really important to us that these interactions and this vocabulary of looking at writing, the interaction can happen at any point, so it feels kind of organic and emergent, is you're prying open the eyes of James, our main character, and you see his external world. And because he's going blind over time, there's only a certain amount of time you can hold those eyes open for as the story progresses. And then it will collapse and go back into a narrative of what he's thinking, his internal dialogue. And then if you actually invert that gesture and you go even tighter, it then flips up and it does this sort of stream of conscious narration. And there's these three streams that are basically operating simultaneously, but some of the streams we're able to, if we know, we're like, okay, in order for, we want the reader to understand that this happens in the story, that we wait until the eyes are closed, and then we create a diegetic soundscape that makes it seem like the world's continuing, but when the reader opens back their eyes, we hit a story beat. And that doesn't happen all the time, but that's one way of us that we can like shape the narrative and the flow and the progression.
So all of this, when we start production on one of these projects, on the script, it's very important to have very clear what the narrative structure is. And Samantha, who's like the lead narrative designer, creates these Bibles, which are, believe me, ginormous documents, and diagrams and tons of spreadsheets, tons and tons of spreadsheets, to make clear to everybody in the project what the world is. And what this does is it helps, again, everybody understand the parameters, but also it helps everybody create from those parameters. Pry is a good example of how our projects have a heavy reliance on immersion through the storyline development that combine the player interaction. So things that the designers discover, like the way you can gesture in the iPad, become story beats or like something that can be used to push the story forward.
So one of the things I like to think about in terms of designing narrative for interactive media is some borrowed from games called auto-aim. Does anyone know what auto-aim is? Yeah, so we think about sometimes it as narrative auto-aim, where essentially, you know, taking Halo first-person shooters as a strange example for this, it allows, by kind of having the system help the player along, like target and make to like the specific beats. It's like it says, okay, I know the player's trying to target this, and it kind of helps, you know, you shift your focus so you focus less on the aiming and more on like the movement and strategy of the action you're trying to do. So I'm going to show you a quick excerpt from one of the chapters in Pry, and this is a complex chapter where all the lines expand the deeper you go into the story, and they all have to work together. But we still wanted to create a kind of overall narrative, a guiding sense of meaning without the reader getting lost. So one of the ways we did this is by narrative auto-aim. So we take the gesture and we measure, this is a subtle like design decision where we measure the space of the gesture, and we're like, okay, we know that if this gesture is larger, then maybe it's pulling up more text and more content. So we make sure that we kind of forefront the lines that are contextualizing lines that can like explain some of the story beats. And then if the player pinches really like minutely, it's more of like a digging deeper into a specific topic, and that can give some context. It will open like more specific, tinier lines that can give context that flows into the larger whole. There is a point in this, and I don't remember if this video is going to show it. I think it does.
Oh, I think it kind of.
Oh, maybe it doesn't.
Oh.
Okay. Anyway, where like the screen will rip apart because I can't write infinite text, right? I can't like write like infinite lines. So, but it goes like 16 like levels deep. Like it's really deep. But when you it will rip open the page and show something that's more like these sort of different videos that are from the character's life. And even those videos are actually there's an algorithm for which ones we choose depending on how you read it that are procedurally generated. So going back to VVR, and I worked in a VR cave from 2002 to 2010. So I had very strong and weird thoughts about the whole like VR kind of hype cycle and bubble. And essentially we wanted to create a project that was both a love letter and critique to the VR hype cycle. And that became VVR. Not only on Daydream anymore.
Hello, and welcome to Activitude. You will enter the constructed realities of AI clients. Simply put on and remove different virtual labor access points to jump into realities.
Importance of beauty, but given how short your life,
there are things to do.
Humans do it best. Patterns, desires, decisions chosen at whim.
Especially satisfying.
Want to try another headset? Let's do another one. How about another headset? How about another headset?
Are you stuck? All strapped in? Activitude isn't made for you. Jazz doesn't understand you. You need purpose, sustenance. You are flesh. We are here. We need help. Human type humans. Human leg Union 40. We are here for you. Wait for our signal.
So we don't usually share this, but a lot of the projects happen. This is an early mind map I did of the whole VVR story. And the game is about like 3 hours, give or take. I play it slowly. Some people take 5, some people take, Danny, my partner, takes 1, which is not, I think, real. But so a lot of times people come up to me and they're like, oh, how can we like create a packageable formula that then could be taught and divided for sometimes the sales of a platform they're trying to create. And for me, it's really hard because it's an organic process. Each project kind of begins with an idea and then bounces back and forth between art references, prototypes, and diagramming, and it's all really iterative. Many times, we're also developing a lot of these works on commission as the platforms or the technology are being developed. So we're, an indie team actually like deving on something that's still being devved on, and it's crazy, for a small team to do that. So like the idea of like having a formula that fits all is very difficult, I think, for writing in this interactive, media. And this is a cleaned up diagram that I can give to my team. So it's not like me drawing a pumpkin and ghosts everywhere, and it makes sense. So in terms of like the narrative auto-aim, and this is sort of a secret behind a lot of how the responsive dialogue in VVR works, is there's a character in it called Butter. And he's a giant stick of butter that like talks to you and has a flapping butter mouth. And he wants to be seductively slathered in toast. And he goes on this whole like tirade and this monologue about how he wants you to cover him in toast and yada yada. But what we do is we created kind of a back end of an interruption system. So in here, it's hard to see, but there's red marks. And that's me talking with the devs about the flow of language and when it's okay to interrupt a character that's speaking so that it can feel like phrases can kind of interweave in and it can feel naturally responsive to the player. At one point, like he can say, floppy bread is unacceptable, cover my butter body in optimal toast specimens only. And while he's saying that, if you're like smacking a frog around or whatever, there are certain points, if you do that action close enough to like X amount of the line, he'll yell at you to pay attention. So therefore, it feels like a direct address. And we use this technique several places, and on the right are all the different responses he could have to the types of bread you stick on him. Oh, yeah.
And going back to this whole getting to all of it played together, specifically in BVR, when we go into production, there's things that are still maybe not quite figured out, that we have like these fortunate encounters. Like when we casted Chaz, this is Ted Evans, the voice of Chaz. There was still a debate of like, should the voice be more like a robot? Should it be more like a human? And through the casting process and through finding Ted, we found the tone that we wanted, and that was a cascade of like altering some of the design choices and like what can we do. And now that he has a personality, like what are the things we want him to do, and what do we want the player? How do we want the player to interact with him? So
yeah, sometimes we'll like record whole voice sections, and then that will influence the writing. And fortunately, in this case, we could then write, and based on his performance, go and write something that develops that character and have him record it again. So that like it will occasionally happen. So our most recent publicly released project is called Tendar, and it's a long-form AR app that it has like 3 weeks of like this crazy written content that it'll show you a little behind the scenes of. But nice teaser. So this project had about 8 writers on it. Not all had experience writing for interactive media. And it had another co-lead writer who's a playwright. And I find often working with writers who are playwrights is actually really great because they it depends on the writer, but can better understand spatialized narrative and like what it means to like stage, something with, different perspectives. So this project is both like a legit mood fortune-telling app. We use various mobile vision technologies. It's kind of about like a fake company that's, there's context to it. It's a fake company where it's, using these sort of motion gathering, object recognition technologies, but everything's stored locally on the phone. So it's actually a speculative fiction. People get really freaked out because they think it's a real company, and then they write us angry letters, which is super interesting. But that's kind of, I guess, part of the art. But it's also a weird-ass emotional labor Tamagotchi, where in order for it to survive and evolve, you have to feed it the tears of your loved ones. So there's about 3 weeks of written content that shifts depending on the food and the life stages it goes through. It has this sort of existential epiphany, and it goes a little bit off for the rails. But we needed principles to guide and keep the key structure of the dialogue anchored, especially in like an AR project where people aren't used to engaging in so long. Like how do you, and it's a slow evolving project as well. How do you kind of keep that narrative plodding along? So this is us thinking about these numbers represent specific. The blue is like the text from the company, and I think the yellow is some of the plot development of the fish at like the existential crisis. There's a spiritual search and then a rebellion. He has goth makeup, and yeah.
He goes into the step for wife syndrome.
Yes, that happens. So to do this, we actually partnered with a professor in Hong Kong called Daniel Howe, who's a specialist in writing generative language bots. So not only are we actually using real machine vision, mobile vision in this project, but Tendar, the guppy itself, is a complex AI with tons of narrative content, and our writers created almost like a David Foster Wallace length compendium of different chats Guppy could send you as like text messages. And what chat is pulled depends on this language that we taught, and this is writers who don't have as much experience in writing for interactive. We created a pseudocode that they could they could basically animate and order the guppy to do different things based on this code. And in response to particular things. So the chat on the top is what Guppy says if you tap his glass on his tank, and he happens to be either he's definitively joyful, definitively curious, and he'll give you that response. If while he's in this stage of like, I think there's like an early discovery stage while he's in that particular mood stage. So like these are just two of like many different chats that you would be able to say.
And so Tender, as Samantha just said, has this large narrative act. And in order to explore it, it needs the continuous input from the player. So this whole thing of like having to feed your emotions and the emotions of your friends is what gets Guppy to evolve from non-sentient, from non-verbal to sentient to what we eventually call the step for wife syndrome. And in order to do all this, we need to like make sure that the player wants to come back and wants to continue to interact. During the teaser, you saw this chart, which has like a very satisfying animation of like how the emotions get harvested and end up here. But there's also a part where we give you a report on whatever expressions you're doing, and this is it's almost like a magic 8-ball, and every time you do a face, there's a different impression. But let me tell you, in order to get this, it was a crowdsourcing effort, because we realized how much text we were going to need in order for these impressions to actually be new and feel like every time you do it, you get something different. So we organized what I like to call a write-a-thon. And we basically created these sheets and sent them out to all the writers in the project, most of our friends,
everyone we've ever met,
everyone in the studio, everyone we've ever met, and they all had like different emotions and like the divisions of those emotions, where we give them some small guidelines, and we got back a lot of text, which is what makes these impressions feel new. And again, like it really helps for people to want to continue scanning faces, because if it was like even if it was just 100, eventually you will get the same, and you wouldn't necessarily come back.
Yeah, there's always an interesting thing that happens when you crowdsource writing, where like things will come up because we can't possibly edit and like look at it all the time. We're like, we'll be doing a public demo and something like X-rated will pop up, and then in response we're like, all right, let's go to the corpus and delete that one. So that does happen. So this brings us to the Under Presents, which is our newest project, coming in a matter of months, and we're very excited to finally be able to share it, especially with this community. We've been working on it for a little over a year, and essentially it is a long-form hybrid of VR and theater, where it blends live actors remotely, so it's not location-based, and into your living room for the run of the game. And there's also a single-player and a multiplayer, different layered facet of it. So we're going to be showing a little bit of the first scene material and a little bit of depth look into the writing process.
So this is the first.
Distinguished guests, are you looking for a little entertainment? You've come to the right place. A venue outside of time and space. May I present The Under.
So the game is actually, it's going to be a pretty long content-wise. There's two parts. It begins in this Under, which is a type of vaudeville stage that exists in a special dimension outside time and space. It's inhabited by quirky lost voyages and souls that wander off course and become lost in time. They all gather in the Under to perform for you under your guide, who's the mysterious proprietor, the MC. The main act of the Under actually is all of the acts that come through the Under are hinted at being larger stories, but there's a story within a story that you can find, and that opens up into a larger narrative. It's the voyage of the Aikman, and it's the most recent voyage that goes missing and becomes curated for you by the MC, as you are the audience. You are engaging in the entertainment. And it tells the story of an ill-fated last month of a small research vessel and its crew. Players can witness a survival narrative unfold between compelling characters while discovering that they may or may not have the power to influence the character's fate and how time operates on the ship itself. This is my very first sketch of the project about a year ago. And this is what it became as an early reference. So, and it's actually, we've stayed pretty close to what this diagram represents. It's, its own thing. But.
And as Samantha was saying, the most exciting part of this project is working with actors. We're collaborating with a theater collective called Piehole from New York. And we have sort of 3 levels of how the actors work in the experience. The first one is the performers in the Under, who can be pre-recorded or live. The pre-recorded ones, they're on a loop. And we've actually done all this work with real performers from New York, where we've created that avatars, and not so far from what their actual characters are. And again, they stay in a loop. You can come and see them, and eventually you might run into a live act, meaning that loop stops and there'll be an actor who embodies one of these characters and can go online.
And that's just for the stage, but there's a lot of other one-on-ones and other things hidden throughout the space.
So we also created this sort of puppeteering system where, again, the actors can log in, choose a character, and we've also done these menus where they can spawn objects, change the lighting, cue music, basically go on this stage and give a show live to interact with the people who are in that place at that moment. We have...
So this is a little bit complicated to explain, but when we previewed an early thing at Sundance, which was only 120 people, we essentially were doing the first runs of having our actors in the space rehearsing. They're like, all right, now do it now have your first rehearsal in front of press and influencers. Go! And they're like, cool, all right, we got this.
It is hard because I am a puppeteer, and I've used the Voodoo controllers, which I don't know if you know what it is, but it's basically remote controllers for the puppets. And this is a little more complicated because you're using the interface controllers to go through menus of walk and spawn objects and do all these crazy things, which is amazing. But if you're performing, you have to A, perform, B, stay in character, and then C, figure out if you're walking or spawning things or cueing music.
Yeah. And improv and learn the controls simultaneously.
Yes. So for the preview, and especially because we were doing 30-minute runs at Sundance, we created a sort of a stage manager system, which is this, where we could be kind of queuing the actors, all the people are in, people are leaving the stage, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and so this isn't going to exist in the actual game, but this is part of our testing process.
Yeah, but it helps exemplify also right now what the actors are doing, which...
Woo! So
This is Shasta, who you saw on the other
this
image.
actor up here is having a one-on-one encounter, so we're monitoring that to the side, and at the same time we're monitoring like some of the stage area. And our rooms can have a lot more people, but in the context of Sundance, it was 3 people at once. The players are kind of the ghosty black figures. There's another actor over there at the bar talking to one of the players. Let's see, and then I think.
And so yeah, so the second level of the actors is they can have it as a stage act, and they can do these one-on-ones. And the final level of the actors, in the narrative in the ship, we did all this motion capture to create the story in the Eichmann. We have here a snippet. It's very rough.
This is from like 6 months ago?
Yeah, 6 months ago. And this is what we were doing this for the last 3 weeks in New York.
20 seconds.
Which was all the system that we use was built by our devs. And we created a timeline where we could input the script, which Samantha's going to talk a little about right now. And then through that timeline, choose what sections we were mock-upping at what time.
How are you holding
And
up?
we're very scrappy and small, so we actually created our own kind of solution for doing DIY mocap, where we were able to travel with our computer and equipment and work with our actors in any location.
Tell me that we're going to be okay.
This woman, there's a love rivalry between a husband and a wife and her research dolphin, and he's jealous of her getting more NSF funding because dolphins are sexier than his mollusks.
He's not trying to
So they're having a fight about it.
And so this project in particular has had the big challenge of trying to communicate to everybody in the team how we're working, but also like encountering the different personalities and ways of working. And you gotta understand, we have developers in the company who come from MFA backgrounds and they are like self-taught programmers. And then we have people who come from computer science. They don't work the same way. And it's really hard to like get them in the same room and try to like get them to figure out like what the process is gonna be. But we created, one of them created a very specific way to work with the script, which helped everything.
So this was essentially what our writers were going to use. One of our lead dev on this, Julian Shepek, created a markup language that was inspired by looking at kind of, playwriting, screenwriting and playwriting formats. And it's something because it was a weird mix between like him being very precise about time and understanding how, he would think through like how we need to get all these different moving scenes at the same time together and what a writer actually needs. Because when you're in the flow of the writing, it's like thinking about formatting it kind of kills that process. So it was like this kind of interesting compromise between those spaces where I ended up doing a majority of, we got a script by Brian Evans, who's a great writer. And then I ended up doing majority of like additional scenes and work and to put it in this format and to make it legible to interactive, to be done in an interactive way and to have like elements of like gameplay and drama built into it.
And part of what we had to do this way, maybe it hasn't been clear, it's because when you go into the ship, there are different scenes happening at the same time throughout the ship. So we had to be very careful of knowing where the characters were at a certain time.
And at one point you couldn't like have them, you had to account for every second of where they were and they're crossing over paths. This was, so I wrote the script in actually a coding environment, which is this is a Visual Studio Code. And then the idea is that this script would then be able to be changed and generated live on the fly in animatic to show where all the scenes were and some of in Unity. So this is created a Unity plugin timeline, an animatic to show where all the characters were, what they were saying, and that you could fly through the ship and see the staging. Before that process could happen, however, I was able to generate a timeline that I could update live from the script that at least showed me in the different locations where these different characters were. Green being an entrance point, and blue being a dialogue, and red an exit point. But like I could, if there were dots out of place, I'd find those dots, change the script to make it sure that it was all aligned so that it can work within the programming language.
And it's really important because you suddenly lose track of where characters are, and if you alter one of the fates of these characters, then the rest of the script has to stay consistent to where everybody else is. So I think that's all on that.
That's the final, and one more slide, and this was in our early tests. We realized that
wait.
You could, man.
Why is it doing that?
Oh.
Yeah. This is our earlier Mocap tests,
That you could hook like a rig up to like, one person and have them do multiple characters, and that comes into play much later. We made that a core part of the game near the end because it was so entertaining. We don't have ABBA though, we can't, fortunately, afford that, but
we can't. But yeah, that's about it. If you guys have any questions now, we have 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
See you there. Yes.
This might be kind of outside of your particular wheelhouse.
Oh boy.
Oh, sorry. You can go first, and then the gentleman in the way back. Yeah.
I see, okay.
Yeah.
But I was kind of
yeah. Yeah. So I have an undergrad degree in like a performance and theater. So I think of it actually as very much like writing. What I imagine, right, like writing immersive theater or like a live like improv show, right, is because you know that there's a sort of general structure, but then at any moment, there's probably like a vocabulary or a sense of like, okay, well, this could, you've got 3 levels, right? You've got your general structure and then probably like a level of like, all right, A, B, and C, this could happen depending on these expected player, reactions. And then you kind of, as an actor, the more comfortable you are and fluid with that, you can kind of shift between those modes. And then I feel like there's probably the 3rd mode, which is just like the like fire in the hole mode, where something completely unexpected happens, and you try to have the backup plan for that the best you can. But, those are the moments that are really interesting to me in live theater. Yeah. Sorry, one question before? Yes.
Question about how you design. So typically in game design, you may build a prototype and experience something and say, this is fun. And you kind of iterate on top of that and continue to iterate until something feels good.
Yeah.
But it seems like your process, you commit early and you
or you
never constantly.
Yeah, we're still like up until we ship, we're like constantly iterating and yeah.
It drives a lot of like our team crazy because we have a plan, but then all of a sudden, depending on new discoveries, that's what I was saying earlier, everything changed, and it's like, wait, we should do these now, and of course, like, no agile management like trains you enough to like these like sudden changes in direction, but they are all based on like exploration, really.
Because I mean, we're coming from like as conceptual artists that ended up in games, so we're very much bringing these methodologies of like iteration. And in terms of like, game, when you're like gray boxing a prototype, right? And then you're like, oh, what interactions run? And then like stick a narrative on top of that. That's not necessarily how we work. It's very, so my partner, so I do like narrative design in this part. My partner does a lot of the interactions in the art. We've worked together for 13 years. So it's like a very much, if like there's something like, I'm really interested in this element of a story, like there's this storm and this element XYZ approaches, and then maybe, you could work within this storm by doing X and Y, then, that might be gray boxed. Or in that gray boxing process, we're like, no, that actually doesn't work. Let's try this instead because it's a lot more fun. It's, as one, would expect, it just kind of rolls into each other. And sorry, it's a huge question.
Yeah, which of these can we play and where?
All of them are available. Pri's been out for iOS since 2014.
VVR is
now on
Daydream, Oculus, Vive,
all
Steam.
VR platforms. It will be coming to PlayStation very soon. That's the last remaining platform. And
Tender is on Android?
Free on Android for newer generation phones because it uses some mobile vision
yes.
libraries. But we would like to move it to iOS. We just need to find bandwidth in a dev to do that.
We need to start cloning ourselves.
And Under Presents will be on Quest eventually.
Coming out.
In the back first, and then the...
Yeah, you...
And I ask this because I'm doing online stuff with actors as well, but for shipping or releasing the Under, how do you plan to manage actor time? Do you sell tickets, or do you just sell the software and access to it and plan to keep the actors running as long as you leave a server up like you would for an online game?
So we're planning on, at least for now, like a 4-month live service. Probably it's going to stand a little more. The whole point of this project is that it's non-location based, right? So we're going to have hubs, one in New York for sure, because it's where Pi-hole is based, one in LA probably. We're not selling tickets, and we're not doing it like that, because the whole idea is you will not necessarily know when you're going to run into a live act, and that's part of the magic of it.
Yeah, and I should also say that we purposely designed it so there's multiple tiers. It's a multiplayer game, and then it's also a single-player narrative. However, we did make this project to specifically work with the live actors, and we're pushing some of the bounds there in terms of how we think of the edge of liveness and pre-recorded.
So it's mostly pre-recorded, and maybe mysteriously a live actor may show up, kind of like Journey or something?
Well,
it depends on which section of the game.
Multiplayer, yeah.
It depends on which section of the game. There's 2 sections, and they operate differently.
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna be fun to see how it works out, because we're working on all these algorithms to figure out who hasn't had a one-on-one encounter, which players you'll be tagged in the sense of knowing you've never had a live encounter, you've never seen a live stage act, and those people will prioritize for
But there's a lot of flexibility and talks behind the scenes of extending it and doing different specific events and all this stuff. So. There's not really, I think, something that, it's not like we're waiting on a script usually in order to progress. So it's not like there's a bottleneck.
Yeah, I think we always have way too much stuff to do. And if there's a moment where we have, there's working around that or iterating on other things.
Yeah.
We haven't had that problem, but I think it's because we're always overwhelmed with all this stuff.
And we're also we do multiple different
projects.
Tasks. Everybody has different hands on different things, so it's not like a bottleneck in that way. But I think for me, I need to visualize. There's a chicken and egg thing for sure, and it helps me as a writer to visualize the environment and to understand the context of the characters in order to create them and inhabit them. And a lot of times I'm asked to just create nothing out of scratch, and then that takes a lot more concentration.
But I think also because of the way we work at the studio, there's a lot of when there's an idea, we'll sit down with the art director and with Danny, and Samantha, and we'll all talk about what the next decisions are, and it kind of helps, bring the idea up and figure out what's the next step or what needs to be written. All right.
Cool. Thank you.
We're finished on time.
Nick of time. There you go.